fact, I guess the third of 8 sessions.
Yep.
And I guess it would be also terribly cliche to talk about how this is a unique year, and we're trying to figure it out as we go along because of COVID. And in this setting, I always look for silver linings. I think most of us do, all of us do probably. And one of the great silver linings is we can serve up the McCain conference in a pretty unique way this year, in that we can bring in, absolutely fascinating top tier speakers such as the 2 that we have today, and expose those speakers to a much larger audience. And the 2 that we have today are not just fascinating speakers, but they are significant stakeholders in the Stockdale Center and the Naval Academy, for that matter, in a lot of significant ways. Dr. Anthony Pfaff, although he comes to us from the Strategic Studies Institute at the Army War College and the Atlantic Council, has been a very significant contributor to the conversation that Dr. Barrett leads this year and in years past. So it's really great to have you here, kind of keynoting one of these events during McCain, and we appreciate your time. And David Luban, for that matter, although he's coming to us right now from UVA, where he's teaching for a year. We know that we share Dr. Lubon here at the Stockdale Center with Georgetown University normally. And I'll say this about Dr. Lubon. Not only does he contribute to Dr. Barrett's weekly conversation, and has since 2013, so this very long-term relationship with the center and the Naval Academy, but I have to say that Dr. Lubon contributes to the intellectual life of the center and the Naval Academy in such significant ways that I can't even express how grateful we are to have him here, and certainly have him here speaking alongside Dr. Pfaff here this afternoon. So, Ed, I'll leave the full introductions to you of our 2 distinguished guests today, and thanks for what you do in setting this all up so far. These sessions have been fantastic. The silver lining is alive. The McCain conference is well attended, and it's because of your efforts. So Dr. Pfaff, Dr. Lubon, Dr. Barrett, thanks for everything you're doing, and I look forward to this conversation.
Well, thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Yes, we're back. Okay. Well, welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining the 3rd day of the 2021 McCain conference. And yesterday, Cecile, Fabre, and Michael Skerker offered us a different but complementary perspectives on what intelligence communities may do to defend and obtain secrets. And so today we'll apply these justifications to particular activities, namely interrogational torture and collecting intelligence through technical means. And basic questions on the table include, can torture ever be justified? And how heavily should privacy concerns weigh when collecting information that's potentially important to national security? So on the torture topic, we have Dr. David Luban, Professor of Law and Philosophy at Georgetown Law and Distinguished Chair of Ethics at the Stockdale Center, as Joe mentioned. And he's authored several books, including the award-winning Torture, Power, and Law. And then also Tony Pfaff, as mentioned, Strategic Studies Institute at the War College, and he's a retired Army colonel. He's authored dozens of works, and my advice to anyone who believes that they have a new idea about a military ethics topic is consult Tony's CV, because he's probably already written on it. So to the attendees, and the midshipmen especially, thank you for being here, and please send questions during the presentations as they occur to you via the chat function. And for the midshipmen, again, preface your question by MIDN, so I can call on you first. So, David, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks, Ed, and thanks, Joe, for the really generous introduction. I want to just start by sharing this slide. What you see here is the cover of a book that was published in 2005. Now, before 9/11, this book wouldn't exist, because before 9/11, there was no torture debate in America. Back then, we thought that torture was what the bad guys did, not what we did. With no fuss at all, we joined the international treaty that bans torture. In war movies, it was the Nazis who tortured Americans, not the other way around. Back then, only kooks defended torture in public. Now, all that turned on a dime after 9/11. Within days, torture was a kitchen table conversation topic, and college students that were polled by their teacher about whether to torture terrorists mostly said yes. Now, I think it's pretty obvious what was going on. In the aftershock of 9/11, we were having a huge national revenge fantasy. I certainly was not immune to it. Unfortunately, it's a fantasy that never went away. Within weeks, officials were talking about how we had to go to the dark side and how the gloves were coming off. The CIA started designing its enhanced interrogation program well before we caught the first high-value detainee. Every high-level official in the government signed off on it, including the president, the vice president, SecDef, and the attorney general. The torture opponents, like the Navy's general counsel, Alberto Mora, got sidelined and left out of the loop in the rush to the dark side. Now, there was a brief moment of reckoning after the 2004 Abu Ghraib scandal and its shocking photos. You know, many of you have seen these. I expect that some of you haven't. And I think there's actually no need to dwell on them. But the thing is that even after Abu Ghraib, within weeks, 42% of Americans answered often or sometimes to the question, should terrorism suspects be tortured? And notice the question, it's not even terrorists, it's terrorism suspects. Well, the fact is that pro-torture sentiment never went down. It only climbed. By 2009, it was over 50%. By 2014, it was close to 60%. It turns out that that makes us one of the most pro-torture countries in the world, according to international opinion polls, even if you just restrict the universe to countries involved in armed conflict. So you think support might be higher, we're near the top. I'm mentioning all of this to give some context for what I'm going to say. A warning, the torture debate may seem like a natural one to have, but for most people in the world, it isn't. Now, to be sure, torture happens everywhere, but there are only a handful of countries where the public approves of it the way we do. So with that caveat, I'd like to turn to the torture debate in America, or rather I'm going to turn to the three torture debates in America. Those three are, there's the legal debate. I want to say something about all three of them. I'm going to start with the legal debate, not because it's the most important, because I don't think it is, but in one opinion poll, it turned out that a third of pro-torture Americans didn't even know that torture is against the law, and they said that if they'd known, they wouldn't be pro-torture. Now, something I find startling is that when philosophers and politicians debate torture, they never so much as hint that torture is a serious crime under our own law. It carries a 20-year sentence. It carries the death penalty if the victim dies, which, by the way, a few of them did in the war on terror. Torture is also a war crime under US law. There are lesser forms of abuse. What the law calls cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment have also been illegal since the McCain Amendment in 2005. And I think at the McCain conference, it's worth remembering that John McCain was himself a torture victim, and he was also a torture opponent. And one more legal point, the anti-torture treaty that we joined 25 years ago says that there are no exceptions, no exceptions for wars and emergencies. Okay, so here's a question then. In that case, how is it that the government lawyers ended up approving it? The answer is that as it's defined by law, conduct has to inflict severe mental or physical pain or suffering to count as torture. And the lawyers ruled that the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, the EITs, aren't severe enough. So to get there, they did two things. First, they set the bar very high. Physical pain or suffering, they said, isn't severe unless it's equivalent to organ failure or death. Now, that's a little weird when you think about it. Nobody knows how painful death is, and not many know how painful organ failure is. So one result is that a lawyer who was briefing Gitmo personnel on the torture memo couldn't think of much more to say than, and here I'm quoting, "If the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong." Well, what else could he say given that standard? When the torture memo went public, DOJ was embarrassed and they quickly pulled it, put in a substitute memo, or rather 5, but the substitute memo still approved the EITs. Now that's because of the second thing the lawyers did. They assumed as fact the CIA's assurance that medical personnel would be monitoring the interrogations to make sure they never crossed the severity line. Now that too is a little weird. Last year, I injured my shoulder. I went to the doctor. He asked me how badly it hurt. How did I rate the pain on a 1 to 10 scale? I didn't ask him how badly it hurt. And if I did, he would have thought I was insane. Medicine isn't mind reading. Medics grading how severe someone else's pain is are only doing fake medicine. And that's not the only thing that's fake in the torture memos. When a client asks a lawyer, is this legal? The lawyer isn't supposed to answer, it is because you told me it is. That's not a legal opinion, it's a permission slip. Now this permission slip came wrapped up in hundreds of pages of legalistic argle-bargle. But there's a remarkable thing. In all those pages, the lawyers never even got to the heart of the issue, which is what I want to talk about now. They focused on severe physical pain and asked how severe waterboarding and wall slamming and being hung by the wrists were, which of course lends itself to bickering over where you draw the severity line. What they ignored is that mental torture is also a crime. One crucial fact about US torture law is that even though it never defines severe physical pain or suffering, it does define mental pain or suffering. And let me put that slide up too. So I'll give you a second just to look at it. So what is severe mental pain or suffering? What that law says, it's the prolonged suffering that comes from procedures calculated to profoundly disrupt the personality. And it turns out that profound personality disruption is exactly what enhanced interrogation was supposed to be about. Now, Congress wrote the law the way that you just saw it because our Cold War adversaries used drugs and other quote unquote procedures to brainwash prisoners. In the 1950s, the CIA got worried and began studying those procedures in an expensive secret program that was called MK Ultra. For 30 years, MK Ultra funded researchers who studied different ways of disorienting victims and wearing them down. The official language was debilitation, dependency, and dread. They studied isolation and sensory deprivation alternated with sensory overload and more subtle techniques. According to a 1963 CIA manual, the goal of all this is to regress the subject to, quote, an infantile state, a loss of autonomy, a reversion to an earlier behavioral level. It's very similar to what today is called learned helplessness. In other words, these are procedures calculated to profoundly disrupt the personality. Now, MK Ultra researchers also dosed unsuspecting subjects with LSD without their consent. One man they dosed ended up jumping out of a window to his death in 1953. In the 1970s, all this came out in a series of sensational congressional investigations, and I think the scandal was one of the agency's lowest moments. President Ford ended up issuing an official apology to the family of the man who went out the window. Now, this is a totally different theory of interrogation than what you see on TV. You know, on TV, you see something like this. What you see is Jack Bauer just upping the level of pain until finally the victim says, okay, I'll talk. Now, that's not what debilitation, dependency, and dread is all about. That program consists of heaping small abuses, one on top of the other. Lights on 24/7, then lights off 24/7. Don't empty the waste bucket so the cell stinks. Round the clock white noise, no clocks or windows. Wake the prisoner up at irregular times. Feed him short rations. Make the cell too cold or too hot. Keep doing this for weeks on end. Now, none of these even make it onto the list of EITs that the lawyers wrote about. Then you throw in the EITs during the interrogation sessions, and after you get the regression and loss of autonomy, theoretically, subjects can quietly be debriefed. Now, the torture memos turned out to be a complete diversion from all this. All they did was go down the EIT list item by item and ask for every item, does it inflict severe pain? Well, that misses the forest for the trees. According to the science behind MK Ultra, it's the cumulative effect of round-the-clock abuses for weeks on end that profoundly disrupts the personality. The EITs are just really the icing on the cake. And let me repeat the legal punchline. The Torture Act defines this kind of prolonged suffering built to cause personality disruption as severe mental pain or suffering. There's no need to ask how severe it is. As with physical pain, this is exactly what Congress outlawed, and Congress called it torture. Now I want to turn to the moral debate. Ethicists, after all, might not care whether torture is legal or not. What they want to know is whether torture is ever morally justified. Maybe there are cases where torturing prisoners for information is the right thing to do, law or no law. Now, presumably, those will be cases where the information is necessary to save lives. The ticking bomb scenario that so many books and articles have been written about. So here are three, all of them have ticking bomb in the title. And we all know how the story goes. A terrorist has planted a time bomb in a crowded city. We catch him, the bomb is ticking, he won't talk. Can't we torture him to save hundreds of lives or millions of lives on some versions if it's a nuclear bomb? And if you answer yes, next comes the follow-up. How about a dozen?
Looks like we might have lost David for a second here. Everyone stand by and I'll give him a call and I'm sure he'll be right back up.
Comes out in favor of torture, or at least that it can. And that is how a card-carrying utilitarian might frame the argument. The other way the pro-torture argument runs isn't utilitarian, but instead it's based on a theory of rights forfeiture. In the ticking bomb scenario, either the terrorist suffers or the innocent bomb victims suffer. The question is who? Well, the argument goes it's the terrorist's fault. By forcing the trade-off, the terrorist forfeits his right against having suffering inflicted on him. Now, these are strong arguments and they've been ably defended by very distinguished philosophers, but they both, I think, have problems. One problem with both is that they have a hard time setting limits on torture within the confines of the argument. If only the numbers count, it shouldn't matter whether the person you're torturing is a terrorist or not, as long as you get the information. Why not torture the terrorist's innocent child if that's the only way to make him talk? Well, why not rape the child if that's the only way? If you think raping a child is disgusting and wrong, as I trust you do, you need to say why. You don't get that answer just by counting the numbers. Well, maybe the answer is that it's because the child has rights. That pushes us toward the rights forfeiture argument. The terrorist has forfeited her rights, her child hasn't. But the argument has a parallel problem. With no right against torture, There seems to be no upper limit on what you can do to the terrorist. If nothing will make her talk except burning or racking or raping, well, duty requires conscientious interrogators to rack and rape and burn, and there is no rights-based objection to it. She made herself liable, the bomb victims didn't. Now, maybe the torture defender is going to protest that some tortures are too hideous to inflict, but that's a conclusion that has to come from outside the argument. Now, I have a more basic complaint about the ticking bomb arguments, and that is that the hypotheticals are cartoons. Look at all the assumptions they have built in. First, you know there's a ticking bomb. You know that the person you caught knows where it is. You know you've got the right person, not somebody else with the same name like in the botched El Masri kidnapping that actually happened. You know the terrorist won't talk, but you're pretty sure she'll talk if you torture her. You know you can't find the bomb any other way. You're confident she won't give you false information to lead you on a wild goose chase. Well, theorists can assume anything they want. That's what makes it fun. They can also assume that this torture thing is a one-off in an emergency, not a policy of torturing every high-value suspect you catch, even though that's how the enhanced programs we know about actually work in the countries that use them. And I might add something obvious. The MK Ultra techniques take time to work. And in the ticking bomb scenario, we're assuming that interrogators don't have time. And let's not assume something else that's often built in, namely that the torture will be used to the bare minimum that it's necessary. Interrogators have a strong incentive to keep going even after the victim has been drained dry, because there's no way to tell the difference between someone with nothing more to give and someone who's holding out. Langley ordered Abu Zubaydah's interrogators to keep waterboarding him even after the interrogation team thought he had nothing left to tell. And my suggestion is this: if you want to have a serious moral conversation about torture, don't talk about ticking time bombs, ever. Don't talk about weird science fiction hypotheticals. Talk about torture used against terrorist suspects where the interrogators don't know what the suspects know or even whether it's going to be valuable. Talk about countries where torture turned from a rare exception to a routine practice. Talk about reality. But now I bet you want to know whether torture works. That's the third torture debate. And it often seems like it's the only one that people really care about, which doesn't really reflect very well on us. But as the saying goes, it is what it is, and we are who we are. The first thing to be clear about is what we're asking. If the question is, does torture ever produce reliable information? The answer is surely yes. But isn't the right question whether you could have gotten the same information without torture? A lot of experienced interrogators say that rapport building works better. But in US experience, it seems that the enhanced interrogators hardly even tried. One of the revelations in the torture memos is that the high-value captives got only one chance to provide actionable information before the enhanced interrogation started. Now, obviously, you can't do controlled experiments on how well torture works as compared with non-torture. Experimenting on prisoners is a war crime for good reasons, but you can study it indirectly. The neuroscientist Shane O'Mara reviewed the large experimental literature on the effects of stress, sleep deprivation, hunger, and extremes of temperature on memory and cognition. These are the MK Ultra tools, but the experiments were mostly done for unrelated purposes. The conclusions are consistent and stunning. All of these abuses degrade the ability to recall information. Now, no doubt people can still remember big events, but real world interrogation isn't about big events. It's about phone numbers and email addresses and bank accounts and safe houses. Now, if that's the kind of information you want, degrading the subject's ability to remember is, to say the least, counterproductive. Maybe that's why rapport building gets better information than going to the dark side. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that torture sometimes produces truthful information that couldn't be gotten any other way. One problem is that along with the truthful information, the victim may give up a boatload of false information to mislead interrogators or to tell the interrogators what the subject thinks they want to hear. If that sends us on wild goose chases, it can impose real security costs. That happened with one of the sources of false intelligence that helped land us in the Iraq War. And once word gets out that detainees are being tortured, potential informants might be afraid to come forward. So even if torture works, the net result might be less useful information, not more. And torture can turn into a recruitment tool for terrorists. Abu Ghraib poured gasoline on the Iraq insurgency. Now, let me be clear. Nothing I've said proves that torture doesn't work. Proof is out of the question when everything's secret and intelligence agencies and victims both have incentives to lie. What I'm suggesting instead is to keep your eyes on the real prize, which is national security. The right pragmatic question isn't, does torture work? It's, does torture help national security? And in the torture debates, that hardly ever gets asked. Now, I hope it's clear by now that I think that the focus on whether torture works is a badly defined question. I also think it's a wrong question in a much more profound way. We only get to it when we push morality and law aside. That's something we should never do. John McCain was famous for saying, this is not about the terrorists, about us. And he was right. So thank you. That's all I got.
Thank you, David. Let's see. Just having some slight technical difficulties here at the Naval Academy, by the way. So, yeah, so anyone who previously sent a question, could you resend them? Because our system went down here. Luckily, we had co-hosts, so you kept going, but I lost your questions. So just please send those, because there were already a good number of them, and I apologize for that. So, and anyone, I just want to mention again, Torture, Power, and Law, David Luban's most recent book on this topic, written in 2014, and really a brilliant inquiry into so many of the issues he raised today. So Tony, you are up, and I think we are working to, let's see. Good, all right. Tony, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much. Let me get this green share going and we'll get started. All right. Well, again, thanks very much for having me here. It is great to be here. I'm going to talk about today what I'm calling panopticon ethics and kind of examine the ethics of doing foreign intelligence collection using mass surveillance technology. And by way of introduction, and that's kind of the order we're going to talk about things. I'll talk a little bit about, espionage in general, how it relates to technology, and then how that would relate to ethics. And then examining and kind of zeroing in particularly how the role of consent might help us build a normative framework for that collection. But by way of introduction, I think it was last year, the United Nations experts recommended an investigation into the possibility that Saudi Arabia had introduced spyware into the phone of Amazon Chief Executive Officer Jeff Bezos via WhatsApp message sent from an associate of Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The purpose, the experts concluded, was to facilitate a massive online campaign against Bezos, who also owns the Washington Post. The Post had published a number of articles on the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi that portrayed Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince in particular in bad light. Bezos himself suggested that it was the Saudis who leaked information about an extramarital affair of his to US tabloids. Now, there is no need, of course, to entertain the question of whether Saudi Arabia's hacking of Bezos's phone in order to blackmail him was ethical or not. Suppressing free speech to cover up a murder fails at so many levels, it's really not worth asking the question. However, it is worth asking if it was impermissible to collect on Bezos at all. I think that one's a little more difficult to answer. National security related information does not just reside with governments and its employees. Amazon, for example, had bid on a contract to assist the Department of Defense in developing the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, which would have provided cloud computing resources. And while Amazon didn't get the contract, it's not hard to imagine adversaries having a legitimate security interest in the program and wondering what Amazon did know or get to know in informing the bid. International norms in general place a premium on reciprocity, so it is worth asking, given a legitimate security interest, would we want to place similar limits on ourselves? Another example to consider is the app Tutok, which the Emirati government uses to track conversations, movements, relationships, appointments, and images of those who use it. To encourage its use, the Emiratis have restricted access to competitors like WhatsApp and Skype, in effect coercing anyone in the country who relies on chat apps to use it. Tutok, however, is not limited to the Emirates. It has been widely downloaded in the United States as well, theoretically extending the reach of Emirati intelligence services. To the extent the Emiratis rely on the app to collect on legitimate threats, it kind of remains an open question whether it's unethical. Now, getting those answers right depends a lot on context. It matters who is spying, it matters whom they are spying on, and why. State actors have different obligations to their own citizens than they do the citizens of other states by virtue of the social contract. So while a mass surveillance program by the United States government against its own citizens might be rights violating, a similar program directed at an adversary may not be. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus exclusively on foreign espionage efforts, where espionage is understood as an attempt to penetrate an adversarial system for purposes of extracting sensitive or protected information. What distinguishes espionage from other forms of collection, or at least for the purposes of this discussion, is its reliance on deception, theft, and lawbreaking, at least laws of the state and where the espionage has taken place. In this regard, technology doesn't necessarily pose any new moral problems. Successful espionage has always relied on deceiving potential sources regarding one's identity and intent, taking of information against an owner's will, and violating the laws of the country where the espionage is conducted. Moreover, it also involves convincing others sometimes not to only engage in these otherwise unethical acts, but to betray their country as well. Also, I will focus on the ethics of collecting the information itself, independently of what one does with it, in order to more clearly focus on the limits of technology, even when the purpose of that information is further intelligence collection. It is one thing, for example, to collect on someone's communications, and another to use what one finds out to blackmailing that person into becoming a source. For the latter, the real question is not whether blackmail in those circumstances is permissible, not so much rather whether it was permissible to collect in the first place. So in the end, what's different? Maybe not as much as we think, at least from a moral perspective. However, as the Bezos case illustrates, technology has expanded the range of persons and information it is useful to target and collect. Consider the Chinese hack into the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, back in 2015. In that theft, they were able to obtain security clearance applications of everyone who had applied for a clearance through OPM. Since intelligence agencies typically do not use OPM to process clearances, it is possible the Chinese use that information to identify which US personnel were likely involved in intelligence operations. In fact, shortly after the hack, the CIA reportedly started pulling personnel from China, arguably to prevent them from being exposed. Now, of course, it's not unethical for states to rule out spies. More to the point, there's nothing inherently unethical about spying. Whether one subscribes to Hobbes or Locke, by virtue of the social contract, citizens have a right to expect their government to protect them from external threat, and governments have a responsibility to do so. So the question remains, was there anything wrong with what the Chinese did? Does it matter that the Chinese government has personal information about American citizens if they don't do anything with it? It does not seem that the Chinese government, as far as I can tell, has used the OPM information to blackmail, extort, or punish Americans, as the Saudis may have done with Bezos. Now, one way to handle this concern is to consider the purpose for which the operations are conducted. There does seem to be a moral difference between collecting for defensive purposes, to prevent war or to better prepare to withstand aggression, than aggressive ones, such as enabling an act of aggression or taking some unfair advantage. In fact, this is essentially the move Jeff McMahon made in his revision of just war theory when he rejected Michael Walzer's idea of moral equality of soldiers, essentially saying that combatants could be not only responsible for the crime of war, but the justice of the cause impacted the justice of their acts. For example, a German soldier in 1939, for example, did not justly kill a French one, regardless of what the German soldier thought about the cause. The problem with this line of argument is that it is of little practical use. We may agree that killing in the service of an unjust cause can never be justified, almost by definition. However, The mitigating factors that typically are integrated into these conversations regarding combatant participation, they're victims of government deceptions, threat of punishment, and so on, mean we can rarely hold them accountable. So while their acts may not be justified, they're generally excused. So we're still left with how to govern the activity of fighting, regardless of the side one is on. I think the same is true for intelligence collection. Now, when it comes to the technical aspects, Ross W. Bellaby gets at answering this question in part, at least, by applying Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. Originally intended, and there's a picture there of a panopticon on the slide, and originally intended as a prison design, panopticon is a system of controls that places guards in a central tower, which is then ringed by cells in which the prisoners live. Thus, the guards can always see the prisoners, but the prisoners can't always see the guards back. So the prisoners never know that they're being watched, but they always have reason to believe that they are. As a result, they would conform their behavior to the guards' wishes. Foucault, as Bellaby notes, seized on this idea as a metaphor for institutional power that induces conformity. And technology has now transformed that metaphor into a digital reality. Now, Bellaby's point here is that the panoptic gaze interferes with individuals' autonomy. People alter their behavior when they believe they're being watched, and in Foucault's view, in order to comply with what they think the watchers want from them. Of course, in the context of intelligence collection, the issue isn't conformity as much as it is about protecting one's own information. The effect of digital technology is not only does one not know when one is being watched, one does not know what information is useful or how its use will be harmful. Russians, for example, collected data on millions of social media users in order to conduct tailored disinformation campaigns into undermining Western institutions. More recently, they conducted a widespread attack that stole identities and person emails accounts in an attempt to further penetrate government, think tank, and corporate offices. So it's in this way that the panoptic gaze of intelligence compels anonymity and caution regarding how communication technologies are used. It also causes a pervasive sense of vulnerability as persons do not only perceive they are being watched, they do not know what is valuable, making it possible to know what to protect and how. While certainly forcing persons in such anonymity is a harm, it is also somewhat self-defeating as it incentivizes behavior that undermines the method's effectiveness. Infringing on another's autonomy in a self-defeating way is not only unethical, it's irrational. So finding a way ahead, even a practical way ahead, requires finding a way to collect intelligence using these technologies in a way that respects others' autonomy. Now, while discussed above, there's some useful things that we can learn from just war theory about just intelligence collection. Just intelligence is not just war. Part of the problem in finding a way ahead is that much of the literature on intelligence ethics tries to assimilate it into the just war tradition. Doing so should not be surprising. Intelligence collection is often motivated by the existence of some kind of threat, frequently tied to defense institutions. And in conducting that collection can place rights regarding property, privacy, and autonomy in tensions with others' rights to life and liberty. Of course, most who argue for applying the just war tradition will acknowledge that much intelligence collection is dedicated to finding threats rather than to responding to them. But unlike just war theory, which only differentiates between combatants and non-combatants, it only really accounts for one kind of harm, physical, as in death, injury, or destruction of infrastructure and so on. They recognize that permissions regarding intelligence collection can vary based on target and harm. Bellaby, for example, argues for a ladder of escalation, which correlates level of harm with level of justification. The greater the threat, the greater the harm permitted. It's not that Bellaby doesn't argue for some kind of discrimination between permissible and impermissible targets. However, just like just war theory, he assumes that legitimate targets are already assimilated into the category of threat. But this seems to ignore whether the subject of this harm deserved it or not. That's because the identity of the subject doesn't matter as long as the principles of just intelligence, which includes just cause, proportionality, legitimate authority, and discrimination, are fulfilled. Now, the problem here is that the just war tradition is an ethic for enemies. However, as Tamara Meisels points out, the enemy relationship is not inherently exploitive. Drawing on Parfit, she notes that we do not use people when we defend ourselves against their attack. In fact, in war, our aims are better served if the enemy isn't even there. In the course of destroying the enemy, there may be occasion for exploitation, but we do not exploit the enemy. We kill, destroy, neutralize, or otherwise harm them. So we want to get at an ethics of intelligence. We have to understand it as an ethic of exploitation. And an ethic of exploitation requires an understanding of how consent both constrains and enables permissions regarding how we treat other persons. Now, consent is a central moral criterion on evaluating our behavior towards others. Murders, thefts, and lies can all be recognized to be wrong, in part because they're violations of consent. You can't consent to be murdered. You can't consent to have your computer stolen. If you tried, you wouldn't classify those activities or those actions as murder or theft. Consent plays such a critical role in moral reasoning because it is the manifestation of the freedom of the person. Kant recognized this in one of his formulations of his famous categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Failure to abide by someone else's consent causes me to treat that person as a non-person, more like a tool than a user, merely a means to my ends and not as a self-determining agent capable of choosing their own ends. In Kantian terms, treating someone as a self-determining agent or end is synonymous with respecting the dignity of that person. Treating others as an end and not merely means requires one adopt a stance towards fellow human beings that demands moral impartiality. It requires we recognize the limits of another's refusal to consent for our conduct. Consent, however, does not entail preference. To make that point clear, consider an analogy from a football game and the shared expectations that result from those engaged in the playing of the game. These shared expectations are the rules of the game consented to by both the players and the spectators, though in importantly different ways. Consonant with the rules, both teams may attempt to deceive each other, even though this is clearly using the other as a means. But since nothing interferes with their choice to play the game, they're also being respected. In this context, the fact that one team is completely overwhelmed by some deception is not the fault of the deceiving team, but of the deceived team for failing to play well by discerning and counteracting the other team's strategy. Failure to abide by the rules of the game, however, will result in the end of the game itself. And certain kinds of conduct in the game are impermissible, conduct that contradicts the conditions on the games being played. But it is conduct that undermines the playing of the game for both sides. Any kind of conduct that results in such self-defeat is irrational relative to the game. Any conduct in intelligence gathering that results in self-defeat is likewise irrational relative to the ethics of intelligence. Now, as the game analogy suggests, different persons can be subject to different harms in different circumstances. Quarterbacks, for example, can only be tackled when they have the ball. Players who don't have the ball, on the other hand, can be hit in order to block them from tackling the person who does. What also follows from this analogy is that participation is not limited to players, so neither are harms, though the farther away they get from the play, they are much more limited. Coaches and spectators, for example, may not be tackled, but they can be deceived. Espionage is enabled by the consent of individual citizens seeking the protection of their governments. In seeking this protection, they impose a responsibility on the government to engage in, among other things, intelligence activities to identify threats from which they need to be protected. So some people may join the game as spectators, while others join the game as players, but joining is something that pretty much everyone does insofar they are a citizen at all. So rather than correlating harms to justification as Bellaby does, I think it's better to correlate harms to consent. Of course, it is important to be clear about what one is consenting to. Football players may be consent, as we've already talked about, football players don't consent to just any kind of harm or any kind of hit. Pulling face masks, for example, are considered interference and thus count as cheating. Now, for the purpose of ethical analysis, intelligence activities can be assessed on the spectrum of invasiveness, where at one end would be passive collection activities that would review information that would, in principle at least, be public, like CCTV cameras in a bank lobby. On the other extreme is malware or other surveillance technologies that target specific individuals and systems to gain full access to whatever information they might contain. Now, the first category of legitimate targets, which on the slide is represented in the upper right, are government and corporate systems and personnel involved in national security. These persons are subject to the most invasive forms of intelligence gathering since they're more fully players in the game. They should, by virtue of their access, be aware of having their communications surveilled, as well as the means to protect themselves. The second category of legitimate threats of intelligence gathering is government and corporate systems and personnel who may not be involved in national security, but who possess information that could cross over, that could have national security implications or might have a dual use. In general, this analysis would suggest they might be subject to passive collection to determine whether national security related information has somehow crossed over, but not more invasive means. The complication here, however, is, as the OPM and the Russian trolling examples suggest, is it's not clear these days what information counts as relevant to national security. So for instance, in the OPM hack, it was the fact that the information was not relevant to what the Chinese were trying to do that allowed them to figure out what was relevant and likely identify, U.S. sources in the country and take action against them. So I think more work needs to be done in terms of kind of understanding what information might have dual use and thus enable greater permissions. But what it does suggest is that there is a moral burden, a greater moral burden on the government to protect a wider range of information that not only it collects and stores, but they're also that of the ordinary citizen. Of course, at some level, one has to look at all the information to determine what is of value. But what would be wrong would be to collect and store non-security related information. The third category of intelligence target is the ordinary citizen. As already discussed, as citizens, they participate in the game, though in a very limited capacity. The question is, what does that limited capacity enable? Seamus Miller and Patrick Walsh point out in their discussion regarding the Snowden leaks regarding NSA collection techniques, that there is a difference between privacy and autonomy. Privacy is the right to control information about oneself, including how and when one is perceived by others. Anonymity, on the other hand, is when one's identity is concealed to another. Anonymity may be instrumental to privacy, but it doesn't constitute privacy. Moreover, privacy is closely related to autonomy, since some level of privacy is required for persons to pursue their projects and interests without interference from others. So there is a right to privacy, but not necessarily one to autonomy. And if there's no right to autonomy, then there would be, it's not autonomy, anonymity, then there would be few prohibitions on collecting basic information regarding identity or activities one does in public spaces. As an ethical permission, all that it really is saying is that anything one does in public, one should not expect to keep private. Having said that, technology complicates the matter as it allows those activities not just to be collected, but also stored. And it is less clear that just because persons engage in a public activity, that they also agree that it be recorded and remembered. This is not some abstract concern associated with perfect voyeurism. The Chinese government may not have done anything unethical with the massive amount of personal data it obtained on US citizens. That doesn't mean that others, such as criminal elements, won't eventually get access and do something with it. This point suggests that measures such as the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation that includes a right to be forgotten are probably good ideas. Not only does it serve as a way of protecting privacy, it also serves as a counterintelligence measure as it restricts information an adversary might otherwise be able to collect. This also does suggest that there should be a conversation regarding what sort of information is stored by providers such that it would be subject to collection in the first place. But there is private space, so the next question would be, when does one consent to the possibility of being subject to intelligence collection? As Adam Didrikson and Kira Vrisbrand point out, consent depends on three elements. It's got to be active, rational, and public. It is active in that it depends on three key elements. It is active that it depends on something one says or does. It is rational that one should have good reasons for giving that consent. Good in the sense that there is no evidence of mental deficiency or coercion, and public, and that persons know what they're consenting to. This last element is the one that primarily concerns us here. Consent for it matter to this discussion should be informed. That means as persons enter the digital space, they should be reasonably aware of what counts as public and what counts as private space within that digital space as well as how their information will be used and interpreted. Didrikson and Rohn also argue that this point calls for a more open discussion concerning the various elements in the intelligence toolbox to enable clear legislation and accountability, as well as more public information regarding the criteria for deeming what sort of information is relevant to national security or not. So if the game analogy holds, then the takeaway may be that to some degree, technology is changing the rules of the game. By exposing a wider range of persons and information to collection, it challenges previously held norms regarding autonomy, privacy, and the limits of foreign intelligence collection. As such, technology imposes additional burdens both on collectors and their targets. Thus, governments, as representatives of both classes, should invest in the means that adequately discriminate relevant and non-relevant information, as well as engage in public discussions regarding what is permissible. And this is how one breaks the pernicious effects of the panoptic gaze. First, it's important to be clear what it is for and use it for only those purposes. Even prisoners want protection from external threats. But to secure the gaze from inevitable abuse, persons need to retain at least some control over what it sees. In this way, a self-defeating dynamic can be broken. And on that cheerful note, I am ready to conclude and open to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Oh, I want to stop here.
You rearrange
Okay.
things. Rearrange things a little bit here. And okay. Yeah, and again, I apologize. We had some problems with the internet at the Naval Academy here, so I wrote down the questions that you'd sent previously. Thanks for sending those. We have more too. So, okay, where do we start here? A question from Midshipman Ibrahim Adam to Dr. Luban, and basically the question is, what's the most important topic to research when examining the decision to use the enhanced interrogation program to formulate it? What was the, this is more of a causal question, but what were the major factors in the ability to get that approved and executed?
Yeah. Well, if you're looking for a source, I think that the detailed source is the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the executive summary of their torture report, which is from 2014. It's, it's a long read. So if you're looking to research the subject, that's probably the best go-to source. For something that's shorter, Alfred McCoy, who's a historian at the University of Wisconsin, has a very good history called A Question of Torture. He has a second book on the same subject, but I don't remember the title right now. But it's McCoy, and they both go back well over 50 years. And so if the question is, well, why do we do it? I'll just report a very interesting conversation that I had once with a former Army interrogator who'd been in Iraq and who said that he had had a lot of contact with detainees and he had never used abusive methods. But he said that he sometimes got people who had been beaten up or had been abused. And he said he always got more information from them. So my question to him was, well, the people that you're working for, they're not dopes. Shouldn't they have realized that they're not getting as good information? Maybe they were. And he said, what you have to understand is that the mentality here is, our adversaries are so bad. We have to get tough. And I don't think anybody disagreed with that. Tougher is automatically better. So that they were putting a premium on information that had been obtained by the toughest methods. And so that information was golden. And so then that golden information means that the people who are getting it are golden. And he described it as a perfect self-licking ice cream cone. And I think that might have, have something to do with it. When Vice President Cheney said we're going to have to move to the dark side, I think that the mentality here was with this kind of a lethal, horrific adversary, tougher is always better. And so let's try, if there's a law against it, let's try to find a way around the law. Okay. I think that's really what was going on.
It's interesting. I know Adam's working on a paper for a class. He might get in contact with you about some other possible sources.
Yeah, please do. I actually have a pretty large bibliography of sources, including references to a bunch of publicly available CIA documents.
Okay, thank you. And then another question for you, David. This is from Midshipman Nels Waranimi. He says he finds your argument powerful, but still he wants to draw this distinction between torture and not torture. So in other words, what is the lower limit of advanced interrogation technique? And then relatedly, of course, is any form of pressure permissible? And if so, what form?
Yeah, there's a journalist who once said, if the question when I've asked about journalism ethics, People I've asked have always said, if you have to ask, then it's unethical. And I'm tempted to say, if you're getting close to the line, then you've crossed the line. Now I realize that that's a somewhat frivolous answer, but I think that the line drawing. Well, let me just start by explaining what the legal line drawing is. Torture is a crime. Cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment that doesn't rise to the level of torture is illegal. This is under the McCain Amendment and then subsequent modifications. But it's not a crime. So the reason that we started looking for where exactly do you draw that line is because, just inferring what the lawyers were asking, they were asked to provide cover. I don't want to be convicted of a crime.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the current law is that no kind of interrogation technique that isn't in the field manual on interrogation is permitted, and that doesn't include any kind of coercive measures. So now what is permissible ethically? I think that it's, then, and this could be debated, but I think that lying is permissible. I think that the kind of pressure that comes from saying, look, so that I'm talking about the kind of lie here, your comrade that we've already caught has told us all of this. And so it's just completely futile for you to be holding out. All you're doing is prolonging your detention here. I think that that's clearly a form of pressure. So what kind of things are off limits? Well, the infliction of physical pain or suffering, this kind of prolonged mental pain or suffering that I'm talking about. Looked at one of the Abu Ghraib slides that showed a couple of naked men that were shackled with women's underwear over their heads. There was a theory going around at the time that Arab men are unusually susceptible to sexual humiliations. So that kind of humiliating treatment, I mean, it's against the Geneva Conventions, except we had a legal memo saying why the Geneva Conventions shouldn't apply. So these are things that are affronts to human dignity that, you can't calibrate the pain or suffering. And I think that if you're going to see what's evil about torture, it's going to be not just the pain, but also that the setting up of relations of total domination that are being communicated through the pain and the affront to human dignity. So, those are very, that's not a bright line.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that there is such a thing as a bright line. But those are the kind of parameters that you would think about. How much of an affront to human dignity is this? Let me just add one more example. The same interrogator that I talked with, at one point I said, well, did you get training in the psychology, from the, they're called behavioral science consultation teams, biscuits, about what to do? He said, oh, they taught me how to induce Stockholm syndrome. And he said, it's really easy. Turns out, all I do is, my prisoner is lonely, starved for company, and I come in, I chat him up. If he doesn't answer my questions, I leave. After a few days, he's really come around to my ideology. And then he added, I decided that I didn't want to do that because it just smacked of the Grand Inquisitor too much. He said it seemed too much like darkness at noon. And it's clear that what he didn't like was the idea that, if I'll put it in the terms of the law, this was a procedure that was changing the other person's personality, not convincing them not to be Al-Qaeda by rational argument, but manipulating their personality. And that, I think, is an affront on against human dignity.
Okay, thank you, David. And another question then from Midshipman Warnimi, and I think this goes to Tony. It's more of a descriptive question related to something that Director Morell said a couple of days ago. He said that technical intelligence depends upon human intelligence. And he's worried about that our humans' capabilities aren't capable of supporting the technical. So what is the relationship between human and technical? And I know, Tony, you worked in the intelligence community area, so you might have some insight into this.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of ways it could relate. I'm not entirely sure what Morell was talking about, but you know, so for instance, particularly if you want to, if you're not doing, so to get access, right? You may not be, you have to identify a path to getting that path to that access. How do I get that malware uploaded into, you know, that computer so it can surveil what that computer is doing? So in that sense, you know, so human intelligence, you know, so to do that, I've got to meet people. I've got to know who's in that organization. I've got to then know who's, you know, maybe vulnerable in that organization so that I can go, you know, target them and get them to, you know, to upload the virus. Or you can do what the Chinese did. I believe it was the Chinese. They left a couple of USB drives lying around CENTCOM headquarters. Somebody said, hey, USB drive, I could use one of those.
Yeah.
Terabytes of information, you know, on its way to probably Beijing. When it comes to mass, the kind of things I'm talking about here, it's more the other way around, because you use this massive data collection in order to, one way to use it, the massive data collection, it doesn't circumvent human intelligence, but it can allow you, like the Chinese did, to disrupt, you know, to engage in counterintelligence, you know, but again, you know, where the human intelligence would come in, it's in figuring out where to get access and then getting that access, I think, for the most part.
Okay. So there's hope for real spies. They'll still have a job.
Oh yeah, no, that means, so that was the nature of the question. Yeah. But the issue with this is that you can still get, you know, you'll never rely on one intelligence collection method if you want to have a good collection program. The challenge here is that this opens things up in ways that the other ones don't. Like the stuff Morell was probably talking about is still relatively targeted. I do not know how they uploaded Stuxnet onto the Siemens centrifuge. I think I read an article where they actually uploaded it at Siemens itself, and it actually is in every Siemens thing. It just affects that one thing, so nobody notices. So to get that in there at Siemens, you know, they had, you know, I'm sure there was probably a person involved, but there maybe didn't need to be, depending on how Siemens was networked. And I don't know the answer to those questions. Yeah, you'll never have one. The thing with this is it's just opening up different kinds of targets, different kinds of information. So, you know, some information I would consider private are now not only useful to Google and Amazon to help me buy more things. It's also useful, you know, it's useful to the Russians. For example, during the SolarWinds attack, someone impersonated a good friend of mine on LinkedIn. We had a conversation. He asked for my phone number. I gave him my phone number. Next thing I knew, I'm locked out of my Microsoft account, and their email is coming from my AOL account to the Atlantic Council with statements like, "Hey, Holly," who's the editor over there, "here's the link to the classified document I was talking about." I mean, it was so amateurish. It was just like, why did you bother? But it took me 2 days to get my accounts back. What information did they steal? My freaking phone number. You know, is that fair game? Was it fair game to use me as a means to get to the Atlantic Council? And if it was the Russians, that makes sense because they hate the Atlantic Council and they'd love to get some, you know, malware in there.
Well, thank you.
Tony, you just need to upload onto the chat function your social security number and your master.
It just, yeah, he got me. I mean, it was like we're having this conversation, went for half an hour. Oh, then an hour later, a friend of mine calls up. Have we just been talking for an hour on LinkedIn? They said, no, but somebody's using your account to do that. And they got him too.
Wow.
Using my account.
Well, I want to take a question from Dr. Uwe Steinhoff, who's in Hong Kong and raised his hand. He did not send a question, and I wouldn't even attempt to pose his question. So Uwe, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here. So
Thanks for coming.
David, I've also written a book on torture. You are not surprised that I have to ask you a question. First of all, I want to make clear, I think in the context of military ethics, it's almost superfluous to discuss torture, because I actually do think there are in reality almost no justified cases of torture. So this whole Abu Ghraib in Guantanamo, this is just out of the question. And I don't think that any of this military personnel here, for example, collected here, will ever be in a situation where they could possibly justify torture. So this is the first word. But I don't, in principle, buy your arguments, because I think there can be some cases of torture that are justified. I mean, you just yourself said pain cannot be the only thing. Indeed, because, for example, if we bomb people, we also inflict collateral damage, and sometimes babies and toddlers are burned to death, which is, of course, very painful. Some of them survive and will, for years and years, suffer under the pain, be traumatized. So if you are against pain and traumatization, you cannot be for war. Then you have to be a pacifist. And the point about the means principle that was also meant, well, you can intentionally afflict death on an attacker. So why can you not intentionally afflict pain on an attacker to stop the attack? For example, a child kidnapper who still has the child in custody and doesn't disclose the information where the child is still attacking the child. So if you force him now to disclose the information, you thereby stop his attack against the child. And I just don't see how that cannot be justified. And your argument that if you argument rights for feature, then it becomes limitless. Well, then you have to be against self-defense again in general, because self-defense also is based on rights for feature on most accounts. So you cannot have it both ways.
Yeah. I think well, first of all, I'd like to just do an advertisement for Uwe's book, for those of you who are interested in seeing a very sophisticated discussion of the torture issue. Let me just take a couple of the points, because I'm not sure that I got them all. But one is about the fact that there are legitimate methods of war that, either on targets, or your example was the children who are collateral damage of a legitimate attack, who might die very painfully. I think that's a tragedy, but it's not what I think of as torture, because torture, as I'm understanding it, is
that. I just say you cannot argue about the pain.
Yeah, and that's why my own understanding, my own definition of torture is not centered entirely on the pain. And I'll just give you what my definition is. That torture is of someone in the torturer's custody or control. It's an assertion of unlimited power over absolute helplessness, and it's communicated through the infliction of the pain. And the victim is meant to understand that as a display of the torturer's limitless power, the victim's absolute helplessness. So I called it a communicative conception of torture. And it's because I'm looking not just at the pain, but at the message that the pain is sending, and that the fact that the pain is the medium of communication. And I guess I think that this is important, because it's the absolute level of pain is very context specific. I am told by women who've had natural childbirth, there's no anesthetic, that there's nothing that they've ever experienced that's more painful. I've been told, and I don't know how anybody would know this, but I'm not going to doubt it, that it's more painful than any male could stand. But it's the context is something in which it takes on different meaning because of all of the attendant joyful experiences. The same pain experienced in torture is meant to show I am completely subservient to the other person, so that the evils of the torture, I'd still put pain as the number one evil, of course, but it's the total domination that is a second evil. It's the use of pain as a communicative medium. So that's I think that's why I don't really want to calibrate. Well, is death worse than torture? I actually have no idea. I would expect that, since we know of case histories of people who have, in the course of being tortured, have made a break for it and hurled themselves out of windows to die, that maybe torture is worse than death. But I'm not sure that these metric questions are the right ones to ask. And I'm sure that I missed one of your questions, but I can't remember what it was. So
Fine, others have questions, so thanks, David.
okay,
Well,
you're welcome.
Thank you, Uwe, for being here. Is Stephen Woodside still here? Because he had a question for Tony, but I wanted him to ask it. Thanks.
Yeah,
join us. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and ask that question.
Sure. Hey, Tony. Yeah, that was great. You and David. Question. So I'm going to pitch an argument to you. I think I know which premise you're going to reject. But so an act requires consent from an innocent person only if it would harm them. Premise one. Premise two, not all acts of espionage on an innocent person harm them. And therefore, not all acts of espionage on an innocent person require their consent. So I suspect you're going to object to premise two, but I'm inclined to think that it's true. But what do you
That
think
might
about
be
that?
fair. I'd have to know in the beginning, if you notice, I specified, I'm looking at the morally concerning acts. So I am so being lied to is a harm, being stolen from is a harm, being harmed is a harm. So you're right. If you say here's an act of espionage that doesn't involve lying, cheating, or stealing, then I would say yes, probably permissible. There's overt intelligence collection. That's an open source intelligence collection. Might fall into that category, which I would say, for me, that's perfectly permissible. Even if you end up using that open source information in a way that the person who created it or owned it didn't expect or didn't want, you came about it, fair game. So I don't know that I disagree with that, but in my examination, I'm looking at the stuff that you would just that would be a harm by virtue of the fact it fits under a category of a harming activity like lying, cheating, or stealing. And there may be more harming activities, and there certainly are others. That's how I'd respond.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, are there some invasions of privacy, Tony, that do not harm?
That's a fundamental disagreement I think I have, but maybe that's a rabbit hole. But I think there are invasions of privacy. I don't think that the invasion of privacy in itself harms, but I think there's a fundamental disagreement there.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, so we have to kind of again, to me, is that it's not so much whether or not you invade my privacy as much as whether or not you, how you invaded my privacy. So, for instance, your mother breaking into your room to check for contraband. It may be an invasion of privacy, but it's being done for my interest to make sure that, I'm not, doing drugs or something. And it's warrant, it may be, it may need a warrant. But I would suggest actually, that maybe a law enforcement sort of way of thinking about it might help us sort out through what would and wouldn't be. But that, like David was saying previously, a lot of that, whether it's permissible, depends on a lot of the context and the relationships involved. It's okay for your mother to come in looking for it. It may not be okay for your brother or a stranger, just because of the obligations, relationships that your mother has and the reason she's going to have for doing that. So yeah, I don't know that I'd say every invasion of privacy is necessarily rights violating, but certainly a lot of them are. And those are the ones that I'd be concerned about. And I did say earlier, we really do need to have a conversation about what in digital space counts as public and private. We really do need to have a conversation what counts as information that I don't really get to keep, I don't get to keep private, and information that I do. And I don't think, and then even more at the other level, what information is really going to be important for, what information when aggregated, can actually be harmful. And in order to actually end up getting it some good policies regarding the ethics of it all. So yeah, I'm usually not one to say it's all or nothing. But clearly there are activities that do fall into the questionable range, even if there are some activities that wouldn't. And quite frankly, if you can do it without lying, cheating, or stealing, then you should, and avoid the other stuff.
Good.
Thanks.
Well, So the students are starting to drift off to class. So let's go for a couple more questions, though. This one to David, and then finally, I think one to both from Pat Lynn. So if Pat, if you could stick around, I want you to ask your question last, which is an excellent one. So to David, what about pharmacological methods of getting the truth? So let's assume that we came up with a better truth serum, based on all this good neuroscience that we're doing these days, and could get the information via that method. Would there be a problem? Or what moral problem would exist in using that means?
Yeah, I haven't really thought this through entirely, but it seems to me that it's very parallel to the problem that the young Iraq interrogator had with Stockholm syndrome, namely that it's changing the person, changing the person's personality in a way that is not respectful of the person. I will say that something you should look at is the very illuminating discussion of truth serums, and they were kind of the snark that was being hunted in MK Ultra for years. In Shane O'Mara's book, this is the neuropsychologist, and where the conclusion is that every candidate truth serum that's been tried it doesn't do that. I mean, some of them are anesthetics. It turns out that one that was was thought to be promising did the opposite. It was an amnesiac. It caused amnesia in the person who was under the influence of it. Now that dodges your hypothetical, which is suppose we had one that actually worked. But I think that we just have to. It would take an ethical inquiry into what kind of alteration of a person's personality kind of under the radar of their consciousness and not through their persuasive faculties is too manipulative.
Right, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, I have a feeling that the neuroscience is going to make this a really interesting question in the future. They're going to claim that this is a harmless method. And then finally, then to Pat Lynn, and Tony, this is in the context of our conversation before we started about your students resisting ethics training. So Pat is voice only. Are you still there, Pat?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear, thanks.
Hi, Pat.
Hey, how's it going, Quang? I mean, Tony. Hi, David.
Hey.
So thank you both for your really interesting talk. So I got this is kind of a big question, and this whole week has been building up to it. So basically all week we've been hearing about how super important our American values are, right? And a lot of other people outside of this conference would also say that our values are a source of strength. But is that actually true, or is that just lip service? If it is true, why do we seem so quick to abandon them, our source of strength, under the cover of necessity? Or if you want to answer this question, if our values really are a source of strength, how exactly are they strengths, especially in competitions with other states? So either question, either person.
Thanks, Pat.
Who I can go first.
Yeah, Tony, why don't you go first?
David? Yeah, I mean, so yes, I think they are. And as far as quick to abandon them, I mean, I would Dave will talk. I think have more to say on it. We also basically recovered them as well. The countries David was talking about earlier that do practice this, they still practice it. And I would argue relative to us, they're probably not as attractive. And that's the operative word, right, in soft power. What does soft power do? Like values, it makes you more attractive relative to the alternatives. So while we did abandon them, in the case of torture, I think largely we've recovered them. And so that may be what values do. And maybe that's how we know that they're enduring, is that even when we get scared, as David pointed out, and even when we get angry and we think we have good reasons for abandoning these things, if the values are actually operative, we get them back. after that, emotional piece fades, or collective emotional piece fades. Now, in terms of, in terms of how they are, I'd have to really think about how to think about some good examples, but or really how it works. But yeah, if you stand for something and that something's attractive to others, they're going to want to be your friends, put simply. It's almost kindergarten politics here. But, there's a reason that, we're able to form, our ability to form coalitions that have a common purpose often depends on not only just having values, but also sharing them with others. And so to the extent that you can embrace values that can be more widely shared, you can build bigger and better, alliances and partnerships. That's the source of strength. If you have a source of values or if your values are not like that, perhaps more authoritarian, perhaps more self-centered, and we've also, we are certainly guilty of, of incorporating those on occasion. You weaken your position relative to, others. But I think in a nutshell, that's how it works and why they're important. And the test is, not so much that do we abandon them, do we make mistakes, is that do we recover from them? Do we acknowledge that they're mistakes and compensate accordingly?
Yeah, thank you. I think a whole book could be written on this topic. That's a really great one. David?
Yeah, I think that to really sharpen the question, we have to ask which American values we're talking about. I think it's, some belief in self-governance is an American value. The Tocquevillian idea of private, that Americans get together and work through private associations to accomplish ends is an American value that, some sociologists think is on the wane, that now we're bowling alone instead of bowling on teams and so on. Belief in our economic system is a value, and it's one that not everybody in the world or in the country is convinced about. Openness is an American value. Freewheeling speech is an American value. I'm not sure that all of those do contribute to our soft power. Some do, some don't. When I began my talk by talking about how we had changed from before 9/11, when only the fringe was defending torture, to the place that we are now, where more than 50% of Americans say often or sometimes to the question if you torture terrorist suspects. I don't know how to interpret that. One way is the way I'd like to interpret it, which is that we've drifted away from our American values. A less flattering one is maybe our American values have changed. But there's a third interpretation as well, which is that one of the most famous things that we think of as an American value is pragmatism. And I think that pragmatism can sometimes mean, well, talk about ethics, that's really nice, but what's it going to take to get the job done? And that takes us to the third of the torture debate. And there, I would have to say that maybe our American values are getting in the way of our ethics rather than reflecting our ethics. So, it would be really, I think a really deep conversation that needs to be had, both also about what kind of soft power we can use to exert influence in the world, is which American values are the ones that matter. What can we say to defend those values against people who think we've got a very different value judgment? And I think that's an important, hugely important conversation to have.
Thanks, guys.
This sounds like, yeah, thanks, Pat. That's a great question. Sounds like a project for the Strategic Studies Institute and the Stockdale Center. So we should continue this conversation. Well, thank you both. That was really informative. And for the audience, Tony and David and I have been in the seminar looking through all the literature on the ethics of spying and gray zone all year. And but every time they speak, I hear something new, and they're revising their arguments as a result of the seminar. So it's been a really rewarding process. Thank you. So Thank you. Well, tomorrow then, just to highlight then for the people left, we are going to have Sir David Omand from the UK on human intelligence, and then again, Mr. Mitt Regan, Georgetown Law, on covert action. So thanks to everyone for attending, and hopefully see you tomorrow.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.